Hi everyone, welcome to this week's session in which we'll be covering mediation and indirect effects. So to give us a little bit of context for mediation and indirect effects, it's helpful to just review some of the types of research question that we've been addressing so far in the previous sessions. So for example, if we are interested in whether variable A, which is manipulated in an experiment, affects variable B, then we might do that by testing the main effect of that variable in an ANOVA, or a regression analysis perhaps too. If we're interested in whether a second independent variable C changes the effect of variable A on B, perhaps in a factorial design, a two-way design experiment, then we might look at the interaction effect of A and C, the A times C effect in an ANOVA. Similarly, if we're interested in whether A predicts B, but A is measured rather than manipulated, then we might look at that in the context of a regression analysis, looking at the coefficient of A and whether it is significantly different from 0. We might also be interested in whether A doesn't just predict B in its own right, but whether it does so while adjusting for other variables, other predictors. And there we can look at its coefficient in a multiple regression, or perhaps in an analysis of covariance, which is another option not covered in this lecture series. Now, one way or another, all of those research questions are concerned with if and when an independent variable affects or predicts a dependent variable. But of course, as researchers, we're often interested in more than if and when an IV affects a DV. We might also be interested in questions of how. How does A affect B? Through what process or mechanism does this variable affect our outcome? And that is what mediation and indirect effects relate to. Okay, let's take an example. Let's go back to that theory of planned behavior example that cropped up in a previous lecture, one of the most widely cited theories in psychology. Now, a researcher interested in healthy eating behavior might look at the theory of planned behavior and think, okay, perhaps people's attitudes to healthy eating will predict whether they actually eat healthily or not, their healthy eating behavior. But why is that the case? Through what process do attitudes predict more healthy eating? Well, the theory of planned behavior might suggest that attitudes firstly increase our behavioral intentions, our intentions to perform a behavior. And it's those behavioral intentions that then in turn predict behavior. So in technical terms, intentions, behavioral intentions, mediate the predictive effect of attitudes on behavior. Another way of thinking of this is the link between attitudes, in this case, and behavior is not direct, it's indirect. There is more than one step between that predictor and the outcome. Okay. At this juncture, I want to clarify a really important distinction that can, in the first instance, be a little bit confusing. And that's the distinction between a mediator and a moderator, or mediation and moderation. Now, these are quite similar terms, but they have quite different meanings and specific meanings in statistical terms. So moderation, first of all, I'll start with moderation, partly because we've come across moderation already in this lecture series. So moderation is primarily concerned or addresses the question of when, under what conditions, an independent variable affects a dependent variable. And a moderation effect, or an interaction effect, as is also known, is a test, as we've seen, of the extent to which the effect of one IV depends on levels of a second, or perhaps even third or fourth independent variable. So interaction effects, as we've seen them in the context of analysis of variance and mixed models, are also often referred to as moderation effect. So if there's an interaction between A and B, it's often, it can also be stated in terms of B moderating, changing the effect of A on the outcome. So just slightly more concretely, from thinking back to the between participants analysis of variance lecture, we had an example of a two-way design, two independent variables, and that allowed us to test whether the effect of status whether perceived conflict as the outcome variable would be affected by the status of participants' group membership, whether they were in a high status or a low status group, but also the extent to which that would depend on the audience to whom they believed they were addressing their responses, whether it was members of their own group or members of another group. So we noted that this hypothesis is specifying that the effect of one independent variable would depend on levels of the second independent variable, and that is tested by the interaction effect. And another way of stating this, quite simply, is that we expected the second IV audience to moderate the effect of the first independent variable status. Okay, so that's moderation. It's basically cognate with interaction, an interaction effect between variables. Now, turning now to mediation, rather than addressing the question of when an IV affects a DV, mediation is more concerned with the question of how, through what process an independent variable predicts a dependent variable. Now, mediation is primarily relevant where our theory and hypotheses might suggest that the link between an independent variable and an outcome is not direct, rather it's indirect. There are two or more steps between the IV and the DV, and that step or steps involves one or more mediating variables, okay, or mediators for short. So when it comes to testing a mediation hypothesis, I'd say the first and probably the last thing also to think of, the most important thing, is to have a really well theorized, well developed and clear conceptual model of how these variables fit together and why they fit together in that particular way. Okay, and a mediation hypothesis is often drawn out in the form of a figure. So in the same way that we schematically represented factorial designs in the ANOVA and mixed models lecture, the same can be done, or something similar can be done, to represent a mediation hypothesis. And it's often represented in terms of a path diagram. Okay, so let's say again in our example, we're interested in explaining healthy eating behavior. And we think that, okay, attitudes to healthy eating might predict healthy eating behavior, but actually that link is indirect, that association is indirect. What attitudes do, first of all, is predict higher intentions, greater intentions to eat healthily, and it's those intentions that are the proximal predictor of healthy eating behavior. So the link between attitudes and healthy eating behavior here is indirect. It firstly relates to intentions and then onwards to behavior. So why is it so important to have such a well theorized and clear conceptual model? Well, first of all, perhaps even more so than other forms of regression analysis, mediation and testing indirect effects implies a causal sequence, that one variable is predicting another, which in turn predicts the outcome variable. Okay. Now, as in regression more generally, the big thing is that the statistics alone, as we will see, cannot tell you which variable goes where in this sequence. So you're left with the question of how to decide which is the outcome variable, which is the mediator, and which is the predictor. And the answer primarily is a combination of good theory, logic, and common sense. So you must be able to justify why one variable is specified as the mediator and not the outcome, why one variable is specified as the predictor rather than the mediator, etc. Okay. And this is increasingly recognized, or rather it's increasingly important to be explicit in our theory-based justifications for mediation tests, for these indirect pathways when it comes to publishing our research. So for example, requirements in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology suggest that if you're going to report mediation analyses, you should be able to explain why this model is preferred to others. Okay, in other words, why the specification isn't some other way around. Or be very cautious when you're reporting the results of the analyses, so as not to suggest that it's necessarily indicating causal relationships, or that it's the only way in which these variables can be fitted together in terms of relationships. Okay, so on to more practical things. So the processes or the techniques that I'm going to cover in this session for covering mediation and indirect effects have a similar set of assumptions. So firstly, both the predictor and the mediator variables the predictor variable can be continuous or categorical, but the mediator variable, that intervening variable, if you like, must be continuous. Okay. When it comes to the outcome variable, that usually is continuous. In fact, all of the techniques that I will show you involve outcome variables that are continuous. But it is possible to look at categorical outcome variables too. But if that's the case, then the type of regression that you'll be using is a little bit different. It will be logistic regression, and that's not something that will be covered in this lecture series. And a final thing to bear in mind here is that it's not possible to test so-called feedback loops in which one variable eventually feeds back and predicts itself. So that's another key assumption of these techniques. We're not testing feedback loops. Okay. Another thing when it comes to representing mediation hypotheses or mediation models schematically is that there's a convention for labeling each of these paths. Okay, so conventionally the path between our IV and our mediator is labeled as path A. The path from the mediator to the outcome variable is labeled as path B, and the so-called direct effect from the predictor, the IV, to the outcome variable is labeled as path C. So if you are reading about mediation analyses, for example, and you see reference to paths A, B, and C, this is probably what they're referring to. Okay. So in the remainder of this first half of the session, I'm going to run through what I'm terming an old-fashioned approach to testing mediation using regression. Now, this was popularized by Byron and Kenny in 1986, and the reason for running you through how to do it is certainly not necessarily to encourage you to do it. I'm not encouraging you to test mediation in this particular way, but rather to help you understand, if you're reading literature which tests mediation using this technique, to have a better grasp of what exactly they did and how to understand the outcomes of their analyses. Okay, so that's the main purpose of running through this, rather than encouraging you to do it this way yourselves. So the Byron and Kenny approach to testing regression, this old-fashioned approach, involves in the first instance, a series of regression analyses. So let's say we have a predictor, a mediator, and an outcome variable. The first two steps involve looking at whether, firstly, the independent variable predicts the dependent variable, so a simple regression analysis that tests path C. And then a second regression analysis, a second simple regression, in which we look at whether the independent variable predicts the mediator, and that's the test of path A. So between them, those two steps test whether the independent variable significantly predicts the dependent variable and the mediator. Hopefully yes, in both cases, if it's going to be mediation. The third step then is a multiple regression analysis, in which the outcome variable is the outcome variable, and both the mediator and the independent variable are entered as predictors simultaneously. And that will give you an estimate of path B and also path C while controlling for the mediator. And what you're looking for here is whether in this model, firstly, the mediator significantly predicts the DV, so in other words, is path B significant? And secondly, you're looking at what happens to that direct path, path C, when the mediator is included. So if it was initially significant here, does it become non-significant when the mediator is entered? If it becomes non-significant, okay, if it's reduced to not significantly different from 0, then that would suggest, or that's often described as being consistent with full mediation, although that's quite a contested term. If the direct path, this path C, remains significant when you've entered the mediator, then that is sometimes you'll often see that described as consistent with partial mediation, okay, rather than full mediation. Okay, so if you see those terms, that's what it's referring to. So if yes to each of these three questions, then that informally indicates mediation. In other words, you haven't ruled mediation out. And then the final step, the fourth step, is to test the significance of the indirect effect, that path A and path B, that sort of over the top of the triangle, if you like, using what's known as the Sobel test. Now, there are numerous different variations of the Sobel test, so it's sort of an umbrella term, but they generally come to the same conclusions if the pattern in the data itself is clear. And what the Sobel test indicates is the significance of the indirect effect. Okay, so is that indirect effect significantly different from zero? Okay, and if it is, if the Sobel test is significant, then it is consistent with a mediation hypothesis. So what I'm going to do here is click on this link, which gives you access to a very handy calculator which allows you to assess or get an estimate of the Sobel test. This is developed by Chris Preacher, and all it requires here, well, there are two versions, but the version I'm going to use allows you to input the t-statistic for the A path and the t-statistic for the B path, so the one between the predictor and the mediator, and the one between the mediator and the outcome variable, and that will allow you to conduct a Sobel test. And actually the one that's called the Sobel test, that the Barron and Kenny called the Sobel test, is actually in this, slightly confusingly, not the Sobel test, it's the Arroyan test. Okay, so that's the Sobel test as described by Barron and Kenny. Okay. Now, just to emphasize once more that a significant Sobel test does not in itself show or prove or demonstrate that mediation has occurred. What it is consistent with a particular causal hypothesis in the sense that it hasn't ruled that hypothesis out. All it is in technical terms is a test of whether that indirect association is significantly different from zero. Okay, so the Sobel test in itself cannot in any sense establish causal relationships, only whether the data themselves are consistent or inconsistent with the pattern that you would expect if there had been mediation. Okay, so let's see a Barron and Kenny mediation hypothesis in action. So I'm going to go to Jamovi. Okay, so here we have some data. We've got a number of variables here which will become relevant later in the session. For now, the ones that we need are attitude, which is our IV, our predictor, intention, which is our mediator, and behavior, which is our outcome variable. And what we're going to do here is run a series of regression analyses. So linear regression. First of all, I'm just going to go to the things that we usually want to ask for. So the f-test, adjusted R-squared, confidence intervals, and the standardized beta coefficient. Okay, but otherwise it's a very straightforward linear regression. So behavior is our dependent variable. We have, first of all, attitude. So this is testing the C path. Okay, so this is testing the C path. Does attitude predict behavior? Yes, it seems so. Okay, I'm just going to duplicate that because the second analysis we need to run looks at whether attitude predicts not behavior but intention as the mediator. Okay, and then the final analysis, just going to duplicate that again. The final one, step 3, is whether attitude and intention together predict behavior. Okay, this is the test of whether the mediator, intention, now predicts behavior, and then we can see also what happens to that direct path from attitude to behavior once we have intention in the model. Okay, so let's zoom in on key bits of the output. So this was step 1, that first analysis, and we can see that, well, yes indeed, attitude does significantly predict behavior. We have a significant path C. Step 2, we can see that attitude also significantly predicts intentions. So we have what we need, as it were, for path A. Our predictor predicts the mediator. Then in the third step, okay, we're testing the effect of attitude when we have intention, the mediator, in the model. Okay, and what we can see here is that attitude is no longer a significant predictor of behavior when intention is in the model. In contrast, this is our path B now, intentions do predict behavior. Okay, so intention is a significant predictor of behavior, but attitude is no longer a significant predictor of behavior once intention was added. Okay. Then in step 4, we can conduct a Sobel test. So if I just pop back to the previous slide, so one of the first t statistic that we need is this one for path A, 5.759. Okay. So I'm just going to go to the calculator. Okay. So 5.759, and for path B, this was the t statistic here, 7.298. 7.298. Calculate that, and this is our the Arroyan test, is the classic Sobel test, 4.49, and this is a Z statistic, 4.49, and a really highly significant p-value. Okay. So back to the slides. That's the results of the Sobel test, 4.49 Z, and highly significant. And in terms of the coefficient, the size of the indirect effect, well, we simply get that by multiplying together the coefficient for the A path and the B path. Okay, so in this case that is path B, 1.627. And if I just step back, multiplied by 0.406, and that gives us our coefficient for the indirect effect of 0.66. Okay. And we can also summarize our analyses, again, using this schematic, using this path diagram. So we can add the coefficients for each path to the model, and again, indicating whether they are significant or not. So the two values for the C path here, okay, indicate what the coefficient was and its significance initially, and then what it was after adding the mediator. So it's representing the change before and after including the mediator in the analysis. So overall then, one might conclude, if one was running a classic Barron and Kenny mediation test, that these findings are certainly consistent with the hypothesis that intentions mediate the effect of attitudes on behavior. And we might write it up as follows. Okay. So that's the classic Barron and Kenny approach. What I'm going to do after a short break in part 2 of this session is cover more contemporary approaches and up-to-date approaches for testing mediation and indirect effects. Okay, stay tuned, and yeah, see you shortly.